Family disputes can make us feel isolated and vulnerable. Maybe you're going through a divorce or a legal dispute about your kids. Perhaps you've spent hours on Google or have even posted anonymously on Facebook to see what others have to say. But are you getting the actual information and support that you're looking for? Our podcast, Legal Lounge, aims to dispel misinformation and downright bad legal information to empower anyone with questions about their family, their children, their finances, their marriage, and the law. As a team focused exclusively on family law matters, we aim to help listeners not only with the information they need, but also with the hope that their situation has a solution. Short disclaimer, please note this podcast is for educational purposes only, and the information should not be relied upon as legal advice or for legal purposes. And we're back here at the Legal Lounge. I'm so excited to have a full house.
Yeah.
We have Tiffany here, one of our modern legal attorneys, and Rachel.
Hi.
Well, Rachel, this is your first time on the Legal Lounge. So tell us a little bit more about yourself.
So I run my own private practice and consulting firm. So I do some private practice work, and then I do a little consulting for leadership. But mostly I'm specialized with trauma and parenting issues.
So you're a therapist?
Yes.
Okay.
yes, all within clinical therapy. Yes.
Nice. So tell us a little bit more about your background. And I know you know Tiffany from years ago.
Yes, we worked in nonprofit world together, which was fun. I lived in Missouri, and when I was in Missouri in grad school, a huge tornado came through. And it was really, really sad, but also kind of an exciting opportunity to really kind of immerse myself in trauma world. And that's actually how I learned about trauma and all the different trauma modalities, and kind of dove all the way in, first working with them, but then working a lot with families. And family trauma is kind of my main specialty now.
Okay. So elephant in the room, what is trauma?
Ooh, what a great question. I would say if I had to define trauma, which Tiffany could define trauma as well, for sure. But if I had to define trauma, it would be anything that overwhelms somebody's capacity to manage that thing. And it could be to physically manage it, emotionally manage it, financially manage it, but it overwhelms your current in that moment resources.
Okay. And so when we're talking trauma, we are talking an experience very individual to the person.
Yes. And so I think sometimes people think, if I'm strong, versus a weak person, then I can't experience trauma then. So if it's like individual, that makes them feel bad about themselves in some way. But I always say it's not about whether or not you're a strong person. It's about in that moment, did you have what you needed to be able to overcome? Did you have those, we call them resiliency factors? And sometimes you have no power over whether or not you have what you need in that moment. If you're in the middle of a park on a day and you're walking your dog, you may not have what you need to overcome a traumatic experience. But that's not to say that you're not a strong person and that normally you don't have great trauma resiliency.
But if you Google the word trauma, there are tons of different definitions. But when we worked in the nonprofit world, I think the best definition was that a trauma is something that overwhelms you in that moment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so something could be traumatic, say, for one person, but not traumatic for another person.
Yes, absolutely. And also in one juncture of life, it might be traumatic versus in a different juncture. And I would say when you're experiencing an overwhelming amount of stress, or if you've had trauma in the past, you're at a much higher risk for trauma presently.
And what are some tools that you employ to help someone work through their trauma?
I would say we kind of think about coping strategies, and those might be internal coping strategies or external coping strategies. So if you think about external coping strategies, it's like people or resources or professionals, like therapy, for instance, or, something outside of yourself, even like your pet or an animal can be a coping strategy that's external. And then you think about internal coping strategies, that's like taking deep breaths or kind of working through something inside of yourself or your thought processes. That would be more internal coping.
When someone is going through the process of learning these coping mechanisms, is there like the end goal of removing the traumatic experience from their memory, or is it something that they're going to have to live with the rest of their lives?
I think sometimes people kind of think, I just want this out of me. I just want it away from me. I want to get as far from it as possible, which is understandable because in the moment it can be very overwhelming. It's overwhelmed our capacity. And then on the flip side, we kind of think about, well, it's always going to be a part of me. It's always going to be like something that I have to deal with and just every day I have to cope. And I feel like it's somewhere in the middle of that continuum, right? So we want to integrate this traumatic experience as a part of our life, not have it constantly informing us. So trauma is kind of out there floating in the great abyss of our brain, and it's informing everything we experience, which is why trauma triggers can be so overwhelming. The smell of something or the sound of something. And so when we've really integrated that trauma into sort of our life narrative, no longer is it informing and kind of controlling our experiences. Now it's a part of our experience. And, sometimes I talk to people about finding sort of the jewel sort of in the mud, so to speak, kind of there's like a gem in this experience, and it can actually make people so much just the depth of their experience of the trauma can become a part of their story. And it doesn't always have to be a horrible way. Trauma is horrible, but our experience of it throughout a lifetime doesn't have to be horrible.
And have you worked with someone who may not know exactly what they're confronting or battling, and you're able to work through, whether it be different coping mechanisms or therapy, internal, external coping mechanisms? Have you helped them find and identify that trauma, or how does that work?
I feel like when you're coming in to work on trauma, sometimes people come in and they're like, here's what's going on. Here's what I need to work on. I had this one very specific experience, or I recognize that it's connected to this thing that happened in my childhood. And they kind of come in like feeling like they know exactly what's going on. And sometimes people really do. They just have deep insight into what's happening. And then other times I have people come in, they're like, my life is falling apart. Please send help. And I'm like, what do you want to work on? And they're like, I have no idea. That's what you're here for. And I'm here for both. I would say like, it's okay to not know exactly what you need to work on. But if you know that you're feeling, I would call it dysregulated, right? Like if you know that you're feeling activated is another trauma term for it. We really try not to use the word triggered anymore for obvious reasons. And so if you know that you're feeling activated or dysregulated, and it feels like it's over the top for the current situation, it's probably a symptom of dysregulation from something in the past. And that's a great reason to go to counseling to get some extra help, because that person who's outside of your situation can give you some ideas of how to cope with what's going on in the moment, but also they can sometimes kind of help. I always say trauma grabs trauma. And so it kind of just like pulls the chain of any previous traumas, which is frustrating, but it's also a new opportunity to work through previous things that you haven't had an opportunity to work through. So,
and I guess from our perspective, Tiffany, we, and I like the word dysregulation, we witness the dysregulation factors in a lot of our clients.
Absolutely. It often comes up in our inbox.
Yeah.
Our emails. Our emails, when we get very, very long ones that seem to be kind of a little all over the place. Like when we're reading it, we're like, wait, there's about 4 to 5 different things going on in this. Sometimes that's an indicator to me, all right, something is going on outside of what's right in front of me. And maybe I can get them on the phone and talk through some of this, and that might be a little bit easier to parcel through some of that. But that's typically how I see it.
Yeah. Building relationships is a natural part of life. But how does the law affect those relationships? Do you want to marry your significant other, but have cold feet from the many divorce horror stories out there? Are you preparing for a custody battle against your ex? That is where Modern Legal comes in. We offer education and knowledge about the law when it affects the relationships near and dear to your heart. To learn more about how family law affects your family, book a consultation with an attorney of our Modern Legal team by visiting our website, emailing us, or calling us at 704-286-6302. Check out the information about Modern Legal Services at modernlegalnc.com. What would you say are like key tools that you employ when you are trying to help someone work through the dysregulation and obviously connect them with a professional like Rachel, but also then try to focus them in on the tasks at hand from a legal perspective?
Yeah. Keeping it to one thing. So I know as attorneys, we like to say, listen, these are all of the things I need. We like to give it to you all at one time. Doesn't necessarily work all the time. So when I start to see that, hey, this is a little overwhelming for them, let me pull back a little bit and let's just have a phone conversation. Talk to me about this one thing right now. Let me get very clear about what's going on with this one piece. make sure you don't have any more questions about that before I go on to the next thing. So it's almost like you're going to have to break this up and slow things down.
That immediately makes me think about kind of brain development and what we
Mhm.
know now with neuroscience about the brain and how, I think people when they're back here in the amygdala of their brain, and I call it the hippocampus, like the stress almond of the brain.
Mhm.
They're really not in a space where they can actually think through things. And so
Right.
if you all are working with them, my guess is that you need for them to be able to be in a space to be kind of thinking sequentially through the things that are happening. But
Exactly.
if they're back there, we know that they can't think through things. So I love that strategy of kind of let's focus on this one thing, somehow kind of using math problems is one of the things that some of my colleagues will do,
Mhm.
where they're like, how do I get them into the prefrontal cortex? Like, how do we kind of like trip their brain into, hey, tell me a little bit about the details of this situation that weren't emotional or super activating. And then in that moment, when you're kind of focused on just one thing,
Mhm.
then they're kind of back in the prefrontal cortex where, logic and reasoning live and the ability to learn or kind of sequence information.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's important, especially like when people are going through litigation, there's a lot that has to happen sometimes really, really quickly,
Yeah.
which can be problematic for somebody who is dysregulated because they can't deal with that kind of thing. So, what would be something that would be good for them to do in those moments? Because it makes me think about like traditional therapy, you want to process all of it, but sometimes we're not in a space where we can do that. So it's like,
Mhm.
okay, what coping skills can I do to get me prepared to process all of that? And I feel like you can take that same approach when dealing with it in litigation.
Yeah. Well, and I always say when people are going to do really deep processing, and some of my colleagues who have a little bit less experience with some of the like, EMDR, that type of thing,
Mhm.
I supervise therapists for licensure, and I always say, gosh, like be really careful about digging in and doing something like an EMDR trauma narrative or things that are really activating with folks because it is really impactful as long as they can sustain it, as long as their system can handle it. If somebody's going through, say, litigation, a divorce, or some kind of family issue or custody battle, or is moving or going through some difficult transitional time,
Mhm.
that may not be a great time for them to do some deep trauma processing from their childhood. Maybe they realize, oh, wow, something got tripped up from my childhood, or this is reminding me of something. But now is the moment to kind of reestablish safety in your environment. Maybe it's physical safety, but maybe it's emotional safety.
Mhm.
And once that safety is reestablished, then I can back up over here and kind of work on some of these issues with my therapist. So I often tell people like, no, let's table those. Let's kind of put those over here.
Yeah.
We're going to work on
Yeah.
those.
Yeah.
Let's get through now. When is your court date? Let's talk about that day.
Exactly.
So,
Yeah. Like, what are some things that
Yeah.
we can do because that will
Mhm.
likely be a stressful day for you, a
Mhm.
stressful week leading up to that because there are going to be appointments that you're going to have. So, what are some things that we can put in your toolbox to get you prepared? So, when you do feel
Mhm.
dysregulated, what are some things that we can do to bring you back down,
Yeah.
or that
Yeah.
you can do to bring yourself back down?
Yeah.
Well, that brings the topic back of having the tools to deal with a stressful situation. And a court hearing itself could be that stressful situation.
Yeah.
A deposition itself could be the stressful situation. And, our hope as attorneys is we try to keep the environment and the situation at a level where it doesn't become a traumatic experience really for anyone. But simply put, having someone sit on a witness stand in the middle of a trial with a judge who doesn't smile at all could be traumatic.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And so it's recognizing that the litigation process itself could possibly further harm someone.
Absolutely. Especially somebody who, maybe the people in that process are not in any way trying to harm anybody. We're going to presume that they're not.
Yeah.
But just doing the deposition could actually be communicating about something that was really harmful. So at the very least, we're kind of pulling back up a trauma and kind of talking through the most difficult parts of it,
Mhm.
But unfortunately, we know that sometimes our clients are sitting in a courtroom with people where there has been trauma that's been
Mhm.
inflicted. And in those types of situations, I always talk to people about different internal coping strategies, but then trying to kind of ground themselves in the space, in the room, so they can feel present in the moment. Because what ends up happening is people, the word we use is dissociate, right? They kind of like disengage and they're no longer really in the moment. But then that kind of takes working memory offline. And all of a sudden we're not again in the prefrontal cortex. So people are sort of just going through the motions, but they're not really present with what's going on.
And I think as attorneys, we need to be looking out for when that happens. And there are tools on how we can work around that. So, I have, for example, made sure I always have a printed out picture of a child. Why? Because that tends to ground a parent.
That's amazing.
And if they can just see it, or if, because yes, the opposing side does have the right to ask you questions when you're on the stand. And that opposing party might have an attorney that yells a lot, or maybe the opposing party is unrepresented and they themselves are just asking questions to someone who may have been, the victim. And in those circumstances, I like to remind my clients, yes, it's polite to look in the eye of the person you're talking to. But yeah, we don't have to look into the opposing attorney's eye.
No.
Look at me, right?
Yes.
I, as your attorney, yes, you're being asked questions, but you can answer to me and you don't even have to look over to the opposing party. On the flip side, sometimes a client will lose it.
Yes.
And we then just have to work through that issue.
And I think it's just kind of you being prepared on our end for if this does overwhelm our person.
Yep.
What are
Our
we
client.
going to do?
Yeah.
Talking with them if this becomes too much, or having a conversation with them beforehand. Do you want to have a signal to me when you need a moment?
Yeah.
Giving them that ability. Like you don't have to say anything because sometimes speaking is too much. But if you all can work out some kind of arrangement to where if I do this, then I need a minute.
Or taking a deep breath, not talking for a moment, not rushing to answer. I'll be honest, and if judges hear me, so be it. I may have to go to the restroom a lot more than I would otherwise because we need a 5-minute break.
Yeah.
And I will say, honestly, judges tend to be very understanding, especially if someone is reacting in a very emotional or outward expressive way. But at the end of the day, though, we only have so much time when we're in a courtroom seeking relief that our client may need. And so we're having to juggle all of these realities. Yeah.
That's one of the things that I talk with clients who I know are going to court because thankfully I have friends who are attorneys, but also having been on the court stand myself, which I would prefer not to be if at all possible, because I never want to be used sort of unintentionally against a client. I've been cross-examined and I know that it's, the job sometimes of the attorney to kind of disqualify what it is that I'm saying. And so I always tell people, sometimes it feels like it would be such an emotional support to have your therapist there. But sometimes having your therapist who's your safe person and typically in your safe space and a space that doesn't always feel super safe isn't actually the best idea. So really talk through that. I think a curiosity of mine would be, do you all have a good idea of clients that will struggle in that space? Or do you feel like sometimes it takes you by surprise?
More times than not, we have a good idea.
Okay. Yeah.
We can absolutely always be surprised. But
let me say this. No one is good on the stand.
Yeah.
It's never fun.
If you're George Clooney and you've been acting for a number of years, okay, that may be a different story.
Yeah.
But it's intentionally not a comfortable space.
Yeah.
And it is meant to elicit the truth. Granted, in family law specifically, when you are sitting in a room talking about maybe the most precious person, your child in your life, talking about your financial future, and you're nervous you don't even have enough money to pay the bills tomorrow, and your adversary is the person you were just in a 10-year romantic relationship with, it's just a much different environment than, say, two businesses, battling over a contract, or even a criminal courtroom, right? It's just a different environment. And when it comes to families, which I like to say I like the game of chess and I love law. I am a legal thinker for sure. I will go down all those rabbit holes, but still the courtroom is not a place for families.
No.
It is there only when it's absolutely necessary. And yet our family courts are some of the busiest courtrooms in our county and state.
Yeah. Well, and I think even George Clooney, who's really good at acting, would have trouble if it was his own family and his own situation
Mhm.
because like it gets
Mhm.
very personal in those moments.
Mhm.
And so I always tell people when they're going through something like that, a crisis of sorts, I realize I'm not meeting you in your best moments,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
like I recognize that, I'm aware of that. But I'm thinking about like coping strategies for some of the folks that you guys are working with. Is that helpful? That'd be
Yeah.
helpful?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It
You
is.
know, I think in the moment, I always tell people when you're really, really stressed, don't deep breathe. You'll hyperventilate.
Mhm.
And so we always kind of know, take a deep breath. But if I'm like really stressed and then I deep breathe, I'm like,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden I'm
Yeah.
more stressed. And so
Yeah.
in the moment that we're really stressed, if we're a little bit stressed, a little bit of kind of deep grounding breath can be helpful.
Yeah.
But if we're really stressed, grounding mechanisms of some kind, like a tense and release exercise,
Mhm.
are really helpful. And so
Yeah.
I often tell people kind of you want to cross the midline of the body into something funky in the brain. I won't explain the brain science, but kind of crossing the midline of the body and then applying a little bit of pressure kind of reminds you, I'm here, I'm okay. Now,
Grounded.
obviously, you can't necessarily do that on a stand, but you could
Maybe.
hypothetically, maybe,
I
you
mean,
know.
Yeah.
I had a kid one time that I was talking about, and he was actually having to testify against a caregiver on the stand,
Mhm.
which was really, really hard. And I love when people get pulled into judges' quarters. When kids can get pulled into judges' quarters, it's so much better.
Mhm.
And I love that most judges really are willing to do that because it's so traumatic for kids to have to especially testify against a caregiver,
Mhm.
just by nature of what it is, right? So he was going to have to testify against a caregiver. The judge did not pull him into quarters, and he kind of knew it wasn't going to happen that way.
Mhm.
And so I said, listen, like what you need to do is like do this tense and release, right? So you tense your hands, kind of release them. It kind of calms you. And he's like, okay, I'm going to do that. Well, they thought he was going to punch somebody. And I was like,
Lordy.
oh, there they fail. I was like, oh, honey, what happened? And he was like, well, I just stopped and I said, my counselor said to do this. And I was like, okay, like noted. We have to, we
Not
live
to
and we
punch
learn,
someone.
right? Like he didn't end up getting, taken into custody or anything. So that's good. But I told him, next time, why don't we do our feet? Like,
Yeah.
clients often have their feet in shoes, or I
Yep.
think, on the court stand, you can even see people's feet.
No.
So in their lap and maybe crossing over and kind of like rubbing each side of their leg could be really grounding, or just tensing your toes. I'm doing it right now as I'm sitting here and nobody knows. I mean,
Mhm.
now because I just told you. And then kind of releasing. And that can just be so regulating for the system when it's dysregulated.
Yeah.
I like to try to break the cycle if I'm in the middle of a hearing and we
Mhm.
have a moment, and it really is to, Your Honor, brief break. Hell, I'll even have my client come walk to me, sit next to me, and be like, "Okay, Your Honor, I want my client to take the stand again." And it
Mhm.
really is just
That's nice.
just stopping them in that moment, because even just taking a short walk
Mhm.
changes, where their headspace is at.
Absolutely.
Essentially, to me, it just sounds like figuring out what are some ways that we can give a few extra moments of space.
Mhm.
It just needs
Yeah.
space to kind of bring you back and ground in some capacity. So whatever ways that we can come up with to do that.
Now, going one step further to your earlier question about if a client may not be the best witness on the stand, we also try to negotiate and settle outside of court.
Yes.
Most
Yes.
family law cases, despite what people may read online or hear from family members, most cases actually do settle outside of court when it comes to family law cases.
Yeah.
And this is why we always encourage individuals who are going or possibly going through the separation process or any family law issue, really get us in early, because if we can, let's try to settle as much as possible, if not everything,
Mhm.
before the mud starts slinging.
Right.
Yeah.
Because once someone has mud on their face, it's like, okay, let's go to court. I'm done.
Right.
No
Like,
matter
I'm already dirty, so
Exactly. No matter how traumatic the experience and process will be, and no matter how much money, time, stress, etc., it will be, it's best to get in there early. And if I have a client that I'm really worried about testifying, that will be a consideration in some of our settlement negotiations and strategy.
Mhm.
And luckily, we do have a number of tools out there, not just sending a letter with a settlement proposal, but we have tools like the mediation process, collaborative law process, and honestly, a lot of the procedures of the litigation process when it comes to family law is meant to encourage settlement and negotiations.
Yeah, which is helpful. I think about, you're kind of saying mudslinging, and, I feel like people are ready for a fight,
Yeah.
in that situation. And it makes me think of, the fight, flight.
Yep.
And then we've kind of added freeze
Freeze and fawn.
or I kind of like to call it appease, because I
Yes.
feel like that's like Bond kind
Yeah.
of has an odd,
I think they just try to
helpless
stick with the Fs. And
endeavor.
they should
Yeah,
have
the
stopped.
Fs. I know. The F is not necessary in the
go.
situation. The A is necessary.
Yes.
But anyway, but kind of that fight, flight, freeze, appease. And so
Mhm.
I always talk to clients too about like, are you in a space of you just want to fight or you want to get out of the situation or you feel completely frozen and like you don't know what to do, or
Mhm.
dissociated is another term for that, right?
Mhm.
Or appease, which actually happens a lot with people that you've lived with in the past.
Yeah.
So that response, if you live with somebody and you potentially can't get out of the situation in that moment, then appease might have made sense to kind of like calm the situation. And that can be really troubling when
Yeah.
people are in a court situation
Right.
where it's like, oh, I perceive that this person's going to be happier. So yeah, I don't need anything in those retirement accounts. I'm good.
Exactly.
You know?
Yes, that happens.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And you're kind of like, as the attorney,
You're
you're like,
like,
no, wait a
no.
minute. What? I thought you said we had just talked, but they're
Uh-huh.
in this appease response. And again, need a
Right.
minute to take a step back and be like, now, who are we? Where are we at? What are we
Exactly.
doing?
Yeah.
Yep. Interrupt our own clients. Nope, they did not mean that. They do want half the retirement account.
No.
We're not waiving that.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Great. Thank you. But speaking of, these responses and specifically in these relationships, these intimate relationships, that brings me to another topic of trauma bonding.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. I think trauma is an intense experience, right, of the system. And sometimes there's a lot of emotional upheaval that's happening. And so if somebody else has a similar intense experience within their system, even if it's like historical, we can kind of bond over that.
Mhm.
Or if you're in the midst of something that's really traumatic right now, in this moment, we can also bond in that space. So trauma bonding extends to the past of like, oh my goodness, I had that same experience. And now we feel like we have so much in common. I have a client who describes having done this. Her husband was going through her current husband was going through a really difficult divorce when they met. She was also going through a really difficult divorce. They were both really upset because their partners, had been unfaithful in these relationships. And they were like, oh my gosh, we have so much in common. And so she's sitting on my couch the other day and she was like, I think all we had in common was that we were both going through something really,
that
really
trauma?
difficult that was somewhat similar.
Mhm.
She's like, but now outside of that really stressful experience, as we're on the other side of it, she's like, we got married really quick. And now we're like, who are you? I don't even know
Yeah.
who you are. And we had just
Mhm.
bonded in this trauma experience.
Yeah.
And so I think, when you think of trauma bonding, it's like, let's bring the intensity down. Let's take the volume down a little bit.
Mhm.
And like, who is this person really? Like
Yeah.
on a normal Tuesday
Right.
Yeah.
versus in this intense situation.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I was thinking of one other thing that I see, and I'd really like to hear both of your thoughts on this, is the trauma bonding in a household, say between an abused parent and abused child, and how that then turns into, honestly, an unhealthy dynamic where maybe the adult is then relying on conversations with that child because they do have that similar experience.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, there's a couple pieces to me.
Yeah.
So I think in some capacity, we all want to feel like we're connected to somebody and to feel like somebody's on our side, like we were talking about earlier. And it just so happens that the person that's on my side is my child.
Mhm.
And it's the parent may not always recognize that's not the most appropriate person because their need to have somebody on their side almost outweighs the fact that they know this isn't the person I need it to be.
Yeah.
But then on the other side of that, there could also be everybody may not know what was going on within the household, but
Mhm.
my child already does. And I don't want anybody outside of the household to know. So me reaching out to my girlfriend or my really close friend about what's going on, that may not be available to me because I don't want that out.
Yeah.
And if I just keep it with my kid, I don't have to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's huge.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Well, and I think too, people do this, right?
Mhm.
And it doesn't mean you're a bad parent or a horrible person, but
No.
it's happened, right? Where your kid says something and you're like, oh, me too. I totally understand. And you feel like you're validating your child, but there's a difference between validating your child's emotions and sort of allowing them to validate yours. And I think if you find yourself in that situation and you aren't ready to talk to your friends, or other people about it, that's a great moment to go seek out a counselor. They
Yeah.
can't tell anybody anything. It's all confidential.
Yeah.
And they can really help you to assess through that in a super non-judgmental space,
Yeah.
to where it's not so stressful and you're not in a situation where boundaries are getting blurred. And now what ends up happening sometimes, right, though, is a child, if they feel like they need to be there for their parent, They step into this, we call it a parentified role,
Yeah.
right? Where now all of a sudden I'm taking care of my parent. That's part of that kind of trauma bond that might occur. But now that person might even go on in life to feel like they have to take care of everybody and nobody's going to take care of them. Not because parents aren't trying to take care of them, but because they kind of assume that role. And so if somebody's child has assumed that role, I would just suggest, man, like, put them back in this space of, hey, I'm here for you. And like, I'm the parent, and you can kind of redo that. It's not like it's too late to redo that if it happens.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think for my role as a family law attorney, not necessarily representing children directly, but rather through my client, sometimes it gets tricky because especially if we see this on the other side, and I'm not the other opposing party's counsel, right? The legal counsel. And they're not going to a therapist and they're not going to external family members or friends for support. And they are just becoming further and further, I guess, ingrained with their child and furthering that trauma bond, if you will. I mean, I think it's a factor that does come up in these child custody issues, and it should.
Absolutely.
Because that's concerning for the child's welfare specifically.
It really is. And nobody wins in that situation, the child or the parent.
And I think the child specifically, they lose the safety in knowing that there is somewhere for me to turn to deal with the stuff that I'm dealing with. Because like you said, if I'm taking care of parent because that person needs me, well, then I can't go to the other parent because we both don't like this individual. So who am I turning to? And then they're just kind of out there. And then the parent that they've kind of taken responsibility for, they may feel like, well, I'm here for my child, but nobody's catching the disconnect that child does not necessarily feel that way.
Yeah.
So it can be such a lonely space for the child to be in. And sometimes they're working on that when they're in their 30s or 40s or 50s in counseling. I'm thinking of a few clients right now. They're like, I was just so lonely. And it's this experience of being kind of caught in the middle. And parents are just going through really stressful situations, but the child feels so alone and doesn't have anybody to turn to. And I always say with parents, like one of the best gifts that you can give your kids is your healed self. Because you'll see parents, sometimes they're like, well, I can't afford counseling for me and my kid, so I'll just take my kid. And I understand that kind of self-sacrificing thing to do. And parents, who are like, love their kids, want to do that. I'm like, man, if you have to choose to regulate yourself, and parents share their regulation, right? I always say dysregulated adults cannot regulate dysregulated kids. It's not possible. We can't regulate somebody when we're dysregulated, but we actually can if we're regulated. And so, your child will forget the name of their play therapist, even though play therapists are amazing people, but they'll forget their name. They won't forget the name of their parent. So I'm like, actually, it would be almost better and more self-sacrificing if you must to put yourself in counseling, because then you can be what you need for your kid, So I feel like that actually might be the better path, and then let your kid get through this. And if they still need some help, then send them to counseling.
Right.
Yeah. And to that point, the children will embody the environment in which they live.
Yeah.
And
y'all have done this therapy thing before, huh?
We've been in family law, and obviously Tiffany's also a therapist. They do say counselor of law.
They do.
But I think it's really important if the end goal is to help children in our community. To your point, it's not just sending all the children on a school bus to therapists, right? There's a bigger issue here that we need to address.
Yeah. Because if you were, like, for example, if you were to do that, when they come back on that bus, they're coming back into a dysregulated situation. And it's like, well, I don't know how much use this is going to be here.
Well, I think therapists going into schools and working with kids has created such an accessibility for kids with therapy, and it's so good. But I always talk to therapists that I supervise who are in school systems, guys, like, make sure that you're touching base with the parents. Make sure that you're allowing the child to teach the parents maybe some of these regulation skills, because ideally your entire family unit at home is in a space of regulation and kind of learning these things, because kids can't employ those things by themselves. They're children and thus have less power in that dynamic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's a tough conversation sometimes to have. I have had the consultation before where a prospective client comes in and they tell me all about their story and the problems in their marital relationship and all this, that, and the other. And so I then followed up like, okay, so you would like a divorce? And they're like, no, what do you mean I'd like a divorce? I'm like, well, you're meeting with a family law attorney.
What were you thinking?
Status alert. And he was like, well, no. I just wanted to talk through my issues. I'm like, oh,
That's a therapist.
that's a therapist. So I have therapy names. And then he followed up and said, no, I don't need therapy. And I found that very interesting because I'm like, why is there that negative connotation sometimes, which I feel like it is adjusting because we are more open as a society to addressing mental health issues.
Yeah.
But why is it at times that negative connotation of meeting with a therapist?
You know, it's interesting because I feel like what I hear from clients a lot, maybe not always, is this feeling of, if I need therapy, it means something has fallen all the way apart. Like it's like admitting to maybe like what I said earlier, weakness, but maybe it's not even weakness. Maybe it's admitting to something being wrong and I'm not ready to admit to anything being wrong. And so I've actually had clients on the flip side who are like, I'm going to meet with an attorney just to see my options. And I'm like, okay, you're going to go back to that attorney. That'll be nice for them, right? But I think sometimes it's this feeling of, oh, no, I don't need therapy. We're good. And I see that actually with couples counseling a good bit. I don't do couples counseling. Please don't come to me for couples counseling. The high conflict is not my jam. I don't do co-therapy counseling either. Co-parenting therapy. No, thank you.
Yeah.
Individual counseling for me. But what I have noticed with couples counseling, my colleagues that do that work, is people come in, right? Like 10, 15, 20 years too late sometimes when they're like, oh, I don't need therapy. Like, we're not going to split up. We're not going to break up. So and it's like, well, therapy makes it so that maybe hypothetically, futuristically, you don't split up, or you can split up in a kind of a conscious uncoupling, which is a great term that I've learned more recently, kind of way where we're consciously doing that. And so I'm like, if you think you might need a divorce eventually, my gosh, go to therapy now so that you're in a really good space to be able to be regulated so that the courtroom doesn't end up becoming traumatic and you don't end up slinging mud at anybody in your family, you know, and can kind of do that in a way that's not traumatic for you or anybody else.
Yeah. Yeah. And to that point, I'm just going to extend it. I have had many a conversation with clients asking me, should I go to therapy? And it's funny because I say yes. Like, it doesn't matter if I've just met you. I barely know your name.
Yes. It's always yes.
Just yes. Yeah. And I get it because some of them will ask the question and be concerned that, well, if I go to therapy, does that look bad on me in a courtroom?
Something's wrong with me.
Yes.
And it's interesting because I have thought through that issue before, but our family court judges, for the most part, they will look at that therapy and say, oh, they're trying to work on themselves.
Exactly.
They're trying to fix any past issues, maybe trauma, maybe figuring out coping skills. And honestly, I have only seen it help.
Yeah. I think sometimes, I have people come in and they're really nervous about a diagnosis. Like my ex told me that I was crazy. You hear that a lot of times from people who have been in domestic violence situations. My ex said I was crazy and this is going to be an indication that I'm crazy. I'm like, first of all, we don't use the term crazy. That's not cool. But second of all, like, your ex doesn't get to decide what's going on with your mental health. And our mental health will be impacted by adjustments or transitions that we go through, and therapy supports that and sometimes can even prevent a future diagnosis. Most of us could incur like an adjustment disorder diagnosis at any point in our lives. But if we work through that, then we won't end up with a more intense diagnosis. And then also, I think there's some legitimacy, maybe historically in the legal system, you guys would know more than I would, to there's sometimes being labels put on people. Like, I think about, in the past, there was that like battered women syndrome idea that was,
it's like, please stop.
Feel cringy just to think about it. But the idea that something is wrong with somebody and that's why they have experienced this. So I think that might be underlying sometimes people's, hesitation, but it's great to hear that that's not the case in courtrooms now in today's society.
No, from my experience, judges are like, please, have you gone yet? Please, I'm imploring you to do this because at the end of the day, especially within the family court system, that's just going to make it better for the kids. And that's really the only person that the judge is caring about. So,
I've told my clients, my judge doesn't really care about you or the other party. They care about the kid when it comes to these custody disputes.
I tell clients, I'm like, the judge is like the grandparent. The kids are here, so you no longer matter. You don't matter anymore. They really don't care if it makes you happy or not. I really don't. Is the kid all right?
That really
Okay,
is how
great.
grandparents are.
They are. They could care less about you once you have the kid. That's it. We're done.
Yeah.
So,
And isn't that how it should be, right?
Yeah.
Like, aren't
Yeah.
we trying to make sure these children, our future,
Yeah.
whether you like it or not,
Yeah.
despite what they grow to be and post on social media, like that's
Well, yeah, that's another conversation.
And that can also be quite dysregulating for parents.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I teach dance and I'm on the board of
How
different
fun.
organizations that benefit children. And I will say time and time again, I don't know if I could be a child or a teenager in current society.
No. You couldn't pay me.
It's so much pressure.
You couldn't
It's
pay me
so
to do
much
it
pressure
now.
for kids.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then they go through a stressor like this, which, I am grateful that I feel like kids are so much more open, even than parents, and certainly more than our parents were, right, about mental health. And they talk about it. They're like, oh, yeah, I have a counselor, whatever. Like, don't you?
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
I do
That's
love
good.
that it's been so normalized for them because they're contending with just so much with technology and, all the things that they have to contend with. But at the same time, the resiliency factors of that are pretty cool to think about how kids are kind of growing and able to tolerate a lot more than we sometimes give them credit for.
That's fair.
Yeah.
That's very
I
fair.
remind parents of that often because they do come in very concerned that, our family is going through this upheaval. You just need to make sure that you are providing an environment that allows them to remain resilient.
Yeah.
And some things that we do and don't do can impact that.
Yeah.
So
Well,
let's
and I
keep
think
that at the forefront.
sometimes as parents, we can't be everything to our children. We try to be, but man, we can't be. And so that's where we have those other kind of external resiliency factors. Oh, that word's fun this morning. But we have kind of those other factors of like, it's good to have family, friends, or other healthy people in their lives. Or like if your kids are going through something difficult, maybe mention to a really supportive teacher or support staff at school or, get your kids some other people in their village.
Yes.
Yeah.
And when in the moment that you don't feel like you can be there for your kid, then I call it kind of the gaps, right? The gaps get filled in by these other supportive figures. If spirituality is really important to you, that can be a really supportive space. And so I think creating extra supports for your kids so they feel like they have outlets that aren't just you kind of takes the pressure off parents when they're going through a big stressor and really, meets the need.
Yeah. And to that point, for any parent, especially a parent who's going through a custody issue right now, is be careful on trying to be that everything and claw that child close.
Yeah.
Because I get it. Maybe you had a really bad divorce. Maybe the other parent is now a sworn enemy to you. But that other parent is part of that network and support system for that child. And there will come the day that child does need that other parent. I would say it's on a daily basis, honestly. But in when I say the other parent, I'm not just talking about the individual, but maybe they'll have a new significant other. Maybe they have parents or grandparents of the child. Maybe they have friends and family. And I like to tell some of my clients specifically that isn't it better for a child to have more love than less? And that tends to resonate in the sense of, okay, let's try to get through this process, which is not easy, but then let's try to create that healthy chapter moving forward too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think when we're going through a stressor, we have this tendency to become polarized and to kind of be in this all or nothing space. And so sometimes it kind of feels like, I've decided this person's public enemy number one for me. And so their public enemy, you're with me or against me, is what one of my clients said recently. And I'm like, now, like, I don't know about all that, right? And so we kind of think about like, our kids will never do this or our kids will always do this, and trying to find kind of that in-between space of like, and maybe we are never going to accept, the future partner of this person, but rather kind of asking, is this good for my kid? And it may not be good for you, and that's okay. Because I hear people say, well, you just want me to be best friends, with their new partner, like, or even potentially the partner they chose when they were still technically with me, and I get that. Like, I can feel the spice, like I'm here for it. But at the same time, like, you tell me that spice, I'm your therapist. But at the same time, no, you don't have to be best friends with them. But that doesn't mean that you can't tolerate them and sort of honor them in your child's presence, and then talk to your friends, right? About whatever else is maybe happening, or talk to your people or your family. But allowing your child to have those extra supports, makes all the difference.
Well, we could talk all day
We really
about
could.
this. I mean, but for our listeners, they may be like, okay, this is getting a little longer. So I want to thank you so much for being here, joining us in the Legal Lounge. Your information is invaluable.
Yes.
Thank you for inviting me, and it was fun to be here. I forgot we had listeners. That's right.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to our discussion. To learn more about me and the Modern Legal team, go to our website, modernlegalnc.com, or check out the links in our show notes to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. You can also call us at 704-286-6302. If you have been intrigued by the conversation and would like us to continue our discussions, please subscribe to the podcast and leave us a review. See you next time.